Welcome to Research Tuesdays at the University of Adelaide. If you could quickly take a seat, that would be great. Thank you. My name is Professor Bruce Northcote. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Research Engagement here at the University of Adelaide. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Terrace, Waite and Roseworthy are built. Thank you all for coming along for tonight's Research Tuesdays event. Positive charge. Tonight we're going to be discussing energy in our future. It's a topic that affects us all, and we're probably all considering energy in the context of our own household energy bills, the solar panels on our roofs, and our domestic energy supply. Tonight we'll talk about those things, but probably a whole lot more. These are some of the topics we hope to cover. The mix of our energy needs beyond just domestic, the future of energy, and the multitude of sources available to us, the role of renewables, the use of biomass, hydrogen, and other sources of energy, the status of our power network and grid, and the challenges around integrating all of these sources, and energy as an economic driver for our state and possible export market. Let me first start by introducing our panel for the evening. It's going to be a panel session. It's going to be a little bit different to most Research Tuesdays. We're just going to sit up here and ask questions of each other, and later on open the floor to you. Our first panellist is Professor Gus Nathan. He directs the University of Adelaide Centre for Energy Technology. Gus specialises in thermal energy engineering and systems supplied by solar, geothermal and the combustion of fossil and biofuels, but also works with hydrogen, wind and wave power. He's the recipient of an ARC Discovery Outstanding Researcher Award, and in 2014 was recognised by the Australian Institute of Energy as its inaugural Energy Professional of the Year for South Australia. I'm going to ask each of the panellists to introduce themselves a little bit more than that as they come up. So Gus, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you, Bruce, and thank you all for coming along. I'm looking forward to the discussion. We always learn a lot from the questions, so thank you. So I'm a local through and through. I did my undergraduate and PhD here. I had the privilege of working under Professor Sam Luxton, that some of you may know, and we still hold the Luxton Lecture in his honour. And through Sam, I learnt the importance of working fundamental research and industry hand in hand, not as being two competing things, but being highly synergistic. And so coming out of my PhD, we developed a combustion technology, which we ended up working in conjunction with the local cement company, Adelaide Brighton. Back in those days, a lot of the engineering was done by a lot of companies in-house. And so then, as the largest cement company in Australia, they were a logical partner. So the technology continued to evolve, and out of that I got to spend a lot of time in the minerals processing sector. I've worked with cement, lime, alumina, copper, steel, glass, most of them. And so working with industry, of course, is important because we started to understand what the challenges of industry are, and then this helped to steer the research that we have been doing. Of course, at that time, the challenge that was facing industry was lowering air pollution such as NOx emissions, whereas now it's shifted towards a much more fundamental challenge of CO2. So with that, we've been gradually shifting our research emphasis as well, and I'm privileged to be part of a great team here at the University of Adelaide, which spans most aspects of engineering, but also with partners in chemistry and sciences. Rachel will say a bit more about the biofuels, and also David, but also into professions with markets. So this is a really rapidly growing area, and we're also now looking at alternative fuels such as hydrogen, solar thermal, and identifying some of the pathways that are actually industrially plausibly to particularly tackle the fuels and the energy sector, industrial sector, which I guess is most people, when they think of renewable energy, they think of a PV panel or a wind turbine, and that's the electricity sector. But interestingly, the fuels and the industrial heat are actually bigger than that by almost a factor of 2. And so these are the bits that we're particularly focusing on, and that's really the key challenges that I'm working on myself.
Thanks, Gus. I'm going to make sure to keep the microphone off you later. Our next speaker is David Voles. Dave is a senior researcher engineer in the University of Adelaide's Power Systems Dynamics Group. He regularly collaborates with government and the power industry on high-level R&D to enhance power system dynamic performance, control, analysis and modelling. David, a little bit more about yourself, please.
We're part of the School of Electrical Engineering, our small power system dynamics group. Our interests are primarily, as Bruce mentioned, looking at the stability of the power system and designing control systems that enhance the stability in timeframes of the order of tens of seconds. It's important to realise, I guess, with the grid that it operates on timescales ranging from a decade down to light speed. So across that gamut of timeframes, we need to be able to stabilise and keep the grid operating. So our particular focus is on those shorter timescales. Very much like Gus, we have developed over the years very close relationships with the power industry in Australia, so that we have taken an approach where the results of our research are embedded in software tools that are employed with the industry, within the industries, to enable technology transfer that the technology or the research that we've developed is transferred to industry and is used by industry in this particular field of power system stability. And I think further we'll develop that further as the discussion goes on.
Thanks, David. Our last panellist is Professor Rachel Burton. She heads the University of Adelaide's Department of Plant Science. She's also a former leader of the ARC Centre of Excellence in Plant Cell Walls, the South Australian node, and was the chief investigator in the Centre's research program. She's a particular interest in the use of plant biomass for renewable energy and feedstock. Rachel, a bit more.
And I don't look anything like that picture up there.
Certainly not. I failed in my job.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure that you've all enjoyed the beautiful weather that we've had today. So those people that have got cells on their roof, solar panels on their roof, were rubbing their hands with glee because there was free electricity. But the other thing that was making the use of that electricity were the plants out there. And I'm a plant scientist, so I'm very passionate about plants, and I work on lots of different plants, but I'm getting particularly interested in some crops that are very adapted to Australian conditions. And my belief is that we should be using all of the plants. So very recently we're starting to develop this idea about when we eat animals, we should go from nose to tail. And for plants, I think we should go from fruit to root. We should be using all of it. We should be eating them, wearing them, but making energy out of them as well. So I've been at the Wake campus for 24 years. I've seen a lot of changes in that time, and we're starting to develop some of these new technologies which are really exciting. So hopefully tonight we can see where biomass fits and plants fit into this new scheme of renewable energy that we hope is going to fuel us into the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rachel, and thank you to David and Gus as well. Three quite different research profiles here. We hope to generate some decent discussion points. Before we actually get into them answering questions, we don't have anymore, a few myths that we might talk about, but we might just jump straight into question and answers. There's going to be time for your questions later on, but first we're just going to get our way with some scripted Q&A. So, now that I'm comfortable, let's just start with the basics. You know, what is our current energy situation here in South Australia? What's the grid? Where does our energy come from right now? Open to the group.
Our energy comes mostly from fossil fuels, but it's interesting that currently in Australia about 40% of our CO2 emissions, and globally about 38%, it goes into the electricity sector. So most people think energy, electricity, but in fact it's only just over a third. And then there's about 32% globally, and in Australia about 40% of the energy goes into industry. And of that, 3/4 is needed in heat. And then of course there's about 20% into transport, And so as we think about energy, we need to think not just electricity, but also how we manufacture the steel, the cement, the energy-intensive products. And these are particularly critical to Australia. Australian exports, about 70% of Australia's export earnings come from the minerals and energy sector. So we have a big challenge and opportunity, to make sure we future-proof, transform our fossil-intensive into what we think the globe is going to be demanding in the future, to the value-added products of the future.
David and Rachel?
I guess my focus in my work and research and relationship with industry, as I mentioned earlier, is concerned with the supply of electricity. And I think it's important that we just take a step back and think about what the grid is and realise, I suppose, that the electrical grid is one of the pillars of our society. It's one of the backbones on which our economy, our society, all of our lives really, as they are now, depend. And we take it for granted until it's not there.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the grid itself?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that. But I think it's important that we understand that, and at the centre of the grid are thousands of people who every day, be it linesmen who are maintaining 40,000 kilometres of high voltage transmission line, or 750,000 kilometres of distribution lines, whether it's highly skilled technicians within and engineers and tradesmen within power plants. Those people are working on our behalf at the centre of that system to keep the lights on, keep our stoves fueled, keeping our fridges powered to cool our food, etc., etc. Now, that's the current generation of people in that field of the power system. And that's built on the back of countless people in the past who have built that system and extended it to the state that it is today. And I think as a society, we owe a lot to those folks. The system itself, the physical system, as I mentioned, is a transmission grid that stretches from Port Lincoln in the Eyre Peninsula, 5,000 kilometres around the coast of Australia up to Barron Gorge. And we have synchronous machines that are spinning at 3,000 RPM, electrical, in Port Lincoln, connected to generators operating at the same speed up at Barron Gorge near Cairns. And those machines have to stay in synchronism together with all of the other power plants that are connected around the grid. And to maintain those machines in a stable state of operation is a significant technical challenge, to maintain instantaneously a balance between the supply of electrical energy into the system that is exactly matched by what we demand from the system. Overarching that system is a set of electricity law, which is a legal and regulatory framework within which the system operates, and the essential obligations under that law are to provide safely and stably electrical energy to consumers when they demand it, and to do that within prescribed levels of reliability and security, and to do that with an eye to ensuring that in the longer term the grid is maintained with a view to economic sustainability and to do that efficiently. Now, we've had some problems in recent times about those latter aspects, but that's the framework in which the grid needs to operate. And at all times, of course, the grid's got to satisfy the universal laws of nature. Until recent times, I thought it unnecessary to mention that, but one of our recent Prime Ministers made a remark that made me wonder whether people really do understand that there are laws that actually underpin our physical systems. And the comment by that recent Prime Minister was along the lines of Australian law trumps mathematical laws. So I think we need to bear in mind always that we can work with nature to the best advantage, but she makes the rules, not economists, not legislators, not engineers.
Sorry, David, just before you pass on, for that grid to be reliable, does it need baseload power?
No, we hear a lot in the media that baseload power is essential for the operation of the grid. And I think it's important that we think about what baseload power actually is. In the past, because of the nature of the loads on the system, it made good engineering sense to provision the system with generation sources that were very efficient at a constant output, and that was a baseload generator. And those generators, typically fossil fuel, coal-fired, have been the engine room of our economy, of our grid. What's happened, of course, in the meantime is that, particularly in South Australia, we have introduced a lot of renewable energy. And the way the market works is that the cheapest power will get dispatched first. And renewable sources are the cheapest form of energy when it's bid into the market. Solar farms, wind farms, when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, they are the cheapest form of energy. They'll get bid in first. So what we need now in order to balance demand and supply is not inflexible baseload generation which likes to operate at one particular output, but we need another form of supply which is load following supply, which is able to fill in the gaps. So when the wind ramps up, we need another controllable or dispatchable source of supply that is able to ramp down and let the wind take over when it's available. The problem with baseload is that it doesn't have that degree of flexibility. It has some flexibility to ramp up, some flexibility to ramp down, but can only ramp down to a minimum level. It can't be turned off easily, the large power, coal-fired power plants I'm talking about. And I guess possibly one of the reasons that Northern Power Station in South Australia exited the market was that it didn't have the flexibility to be able to ramp up and down as required to match the conditions of renewable sources being the first to be dispatched, because when they're there, they are the cheapest. And essentially those sources are becoming the new base generation, and we need to fill in the gaps, as I mentioned.
Thanks, David. Rachel, from a plant scientist, what are the sources of energy that plants can provide for us?
So plants fix their energy from the sun, and when you talk about biomass, biomass is essentially anything that's living, and that includes you guys. So your biomass and your waste that comes out is also biomass. So anything in an area is biomass. So the fossil fuels that we dig up are also biomass. They just happen to be millions of years old, and I think should probably be left in the ground in peace. So what happened when they were made was that algae and other organic deposits were made, and they got squashed in a strata, and then they got squeezed and heated over millions of years, and they made fossil fuels. So they made coal and oil, and they were usually algal deposits and peat beds that got squashed. So they were biomass. They were living things that fixed their carbon from the sun, made them into sugars and proteins and all those things. So today, when we talk about biomass, really what we're talking about is biomass that's growing now. And when you think that a year on this planet, 180 billion tonnes of cellulosic biomass grows, that's a lot every year. And what I mean by cellulosic biomass is that it's mostly made of cellulose, which is the cell walls of plants that protect them and keep them upright. And cellulose is essentially a chain of glucose molecules. And glucose is energy. It's what we use to keep our brains running. And it's sugars that we can, and carbon that we can use for energy. And then lignin is a bit of a bugbear because it's kind of this waterproofing polymer that wraps around everything. Now, these aren't very soluble or very easy things to get at, which is probably a good thing, because if most of you went out in the rain, you wouldn't really want your clothes to dissolve, would you? So think about that. But, oh, now I am. So it's really difficult to get at the energy that's inside biomass, because essentially the plants put it together to make it tough and strong, to keep everything, to keep the plants living and upright, and we have to break that apart. So we have to find ways of breaking that apart that are economically viable, but also not going to damage the environment. So we could blast them with a load of acid, that would break them apart, but then you've got to get rid of all the acid and it's not very environmentally friendly. So biomass is a resource that we have to be quite clever about how we use. It's also not very economic at the moment to gather large amounts of biomass. So, for example, wheat straw is very low value, and if you try and gather it from all the different farms that grow it, you're going to spend more on the truck that, dragging it around than you're going to get out of it. So what we've got to do is try and integrate the biomass that we are growing, and maybe we can use it with solar, and maybe we can use solar energy to break apart the biomass, and we've got to get to a state where basically it's carbon neutral. So those are the things, the challenges that are facing us with biomass, but it's always going to be there. It's growing every year, and as I said, if you use the other parts of the plant for high value, so you're eating them or you're making fibres out of them, clothes, building materials, etc., it's kind of a bonus that you can use them for energy. So I think we need to get smarter about using plants, all of plants, not just the bits that we want. And I think an integrated type of energy system where we use solar, wind, etc., get away from fossil fuels but use the biomass that's growing now, then we can help with the carbon, we can sequester carbon, we can help with climate change, and we can make some smart choices about not digging up fossil fuels.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm pretty sure that people in the audience here have some concerns about your home energy use. Gus, perhaps you can talk to us about what our mix of energy needs might be beyond just home energy use.
So the industrial energy is one of the ones I mentioned briefly, but it's interesting to think, for example, in Australia, we have big energy demands. In fact, for example, alumina, it constitutes about 40% of our industrial greenhouse emissions in one process. So the steel, the cement, all these products that we have around us, they're energy intensive. We have to put in energy to convert the raw materials into a finished product. And those energy intensive processes are also potentially high value to Australia. Currently, 90% of our iron ore is just exported as ore. But if we could convert this to a high value product such as steel, we could add something like $100 billion to the Australian economy. So there's massive potential. Of course, there are many barriers to doing that as well, because currently labour's been, and the market drivers have driven a lot of that processing to be offshore. However, as renewable energy becomes more cheaper, and we've got great resources here, there's potential for us to swing some of these around. So the industrial energy is already about a third of Australia's energy demands, and could easily become even more than that in the future. And transport, we know that currently in the transportation sector, there is a growing shift to electrify things like automotive, like cars, etc. But when it comes to things like air transportation, currently we don't have alternatives to liquid fuels. So we expect, and air transportation is growing at about 5% a year, so we have an ongoing need for some liquid fuels in our energy mix. So there are many, many alternative types of energy that are needed to sustain our economy.
Yeah, thanks, Gus. So how are the energy needs going to change in the future? What are some of the alternative energy options that are going to be available to us into the future? Open up to anybody.
I'll start on that. So I guess one of the critical opportunities we see is the growing opportunities in hydrogen as one of the alternative fuels that is carbon free, and we'll come more to that maybe in the future. But then the biomass, as Rachel can comment more as well, but this is one of the feedstock that can be part of some of the energy mix of the future. Of course, we see in the renewable energy space, we have the photovoltaic cells and wind, which are the ones we're most familiar with. But in addition to that, solar thermal energy is the type of power station that was going to be built, or proposed to be built, and still may under a different guise up in Port Augusta. And in addition to electricity, when you're directly transforming heat, so this is when the mirrors are reflecting into a central receiver. If you're making heat directly, then this is the kind of heat that can also be put into industrial processes in the future. So there are many different ways in which the future of the energy sector are beyond just the electrical system.
I guess getting back to the electrical system, as Gus I think has mentioned, roughly a third of our energy consumption within Australia is consumed as electrical energy. And just developing on Gus's point about alumina, Australia has, about 4 aluminium smelters. So this takes alumina that's produced in Australia, or some of it at least, and smelts that alumina to produce aluminium. So 4 sites across Australia, one in Boyne Island in Gladstone in Queensland, one down at Tomago in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, one down in Portland in Victoria, and another in northern Tasmania. Together, those 4 sites probably consume about between 10 to 15% of all of the electrical energy that's produced in the country. The question is, can we drive that industry, which currently relies on constant power input, can that be driven by a variable supply so that the process is consumes more power when there's an abundance of renewable energy, and consumes less power when there's a deficit of renewable energy. In other words, to be able to work with renewable energy so that we can continue to produce aluminium, but with a renewable mix, with the aluminium industry actually contributing to the ability to shift load from times of peak supply to lower supply and so forth. There are investigations going on in aluminium smelters in Germany and possibly elsewhere that is looking seriously at that. As you know, in Germany, the tendency to renewable energy is occurring probably much more rapidly than it is here in Australia. And so they're having to develop techniques to handle variable supply. I think it's also interesting to think about the fact that for millennia, we as humans have lived with intermittency. Our water supply, the most fundamental thing to life, is intermittent. We only get water when it rains, fresh water. We've developed ways of storing water so that it can be used at our convenience when it's needed. So there's a lot that we can learn from the folks in the water field, and we've been working with people in civil engineering at this university to think about how we can develop storage and load shifting techniques and so forth, so that we can better live with intermittency in our energy supply, as we've done in all sorts of ways with water. So whilst this is not so much on the energy source, it's about living with intermittent supplies and then utilising different storage technologies, of which there are many beyond batteries. A lot of us have heard about the battery, for example, installed at the big battery up at Jamestown, the Hornsdale battery, which is very successful. It's small in terms of the storage that the grid will ultimately need, but has proved to be very successful. We're talking about pump storage hydro, which is essentially a means of letting water run down a hill and drive a turbine when the reservoir up the top is full, and doing that when there's a deficit of renewable energy. And then when there's a surplus of renewable energy, taking the water from the lower reservoir and pumping it back up the hill again, so it's ready to be reused in a closed system in order to be able to be reused again when there's a deficit of energy. It may sound odd in a flat state like South Australia that there would be pumped hydro storage opportunities, but there are. Up in the Gawler Ranges, between Whyalla and Port Augusta, there are features in the landscape where it will be possible, and people are seriously investigating this, of taking water from a lower level reservoir to an upper level reservoir in a pumped storage hydro facility with considerable capacity. Just to give you a sense of the scale, the Hornsdale battery has a capacity of 129 megawatt hours. The proposed Snowy Hydro 2 scheme has a capacity of 350,000 megawatt hours. So we're talking about very different scales of storage between what's achievable with a lithium battery and what's achievable with pumped hydro. And as it stands at the moment, pumped hydro schemes are significantly cheaper and have much longer lives than do our lithium battery alternatives. So I'll perhaps pass over to...
So we've heard from Gus and David that we're going to need fuel, energy to make electricity, and also we're going to need to be able to run our trucks and our cars and fly our planes. So we're going to need liquid and solid. So how does that work with plants? So we can actually make both. And there's new technology now where essentially we can do what nature has taken millions of years to do in an afternoon. So when you think about the fuels that you probably know about as biofuels, they're probably bioethanol and biodiesel. Those are two probably things that are familiar to you. And essentially they rely on fermentation for the bioethanol, where you're doing the same thing that you are as making beer, you're just making beer that tastes worse. So, and that you can put in your car. Don't put beer in your car, won't work. But that is essentially the basis of it, and you're using yeast, and essentially the yeast gets stuck because the alcohol poisons them. So they only have a certain level that they can go to. So we can make bioethanol that we can put into petrol that will give us a liquid fuel. We can make biodiesel from oils, but really we should be eating those oils. So this is a big thing for me. I have a moral issue that we shouldn't be using food that we can eat to make into biofuels. So we shouldn't be using sugars and starches because they are calorific sources of food for humans. We should be using the bit that we can't really eat, which is the lignocellulosic bit that I explained before. So we've got bioethanol and biodiesel, but now we've kind of gone past them. So we've got new technology now where we can take material, plant material, we've gathered it all, and we've got our wheat straw on our truck, and now we can essentially do the same thing that has been done to it in the Earth's crust. We can squeeze it, so pressure, and we can heat it. And that means that we can do two things to it. We can, if we do it at sort of, medium temperature and not for too long, then we make these kind of pellets. or this material which is called torrefying. And anybody that drinks coffee, so this is what you do in France to roast coffee beans. You torrefy them. And so you are roasting your biomass, and then you can make these pellets, which are essentially like coal. And that means you can store your biomass indefinitely because it's not going to go mouldy and smelly. It's not going to try and make itself into silage. So, and you get an energy densification during that process. So that means that those torrefied pellets can be used to drive the water uphill, for example, by burning it. So there's a coal replacement. And that doesn't take very long to do. If you take your biomass and you heat it at a higher pressure and a higher temperature, and essentially you can make what's called a green crude. So this is like crude oil. It looks exactly like crude oil that you drill out of the ground, but it came out of this reactor, and you can do it in just a few hours. So now that might sound like something that's going to be expensive, but if you combine that with solar energy, so if you can collect the energy of the sun and you can use that to keep your reactor going, then essentially you end up with a crude oil that you can then fractionate into jet fuel, fuel for ships, transport, etc. So we now have the technology to be able to convert biomass into things that we recognise, and we can use them for plastics as well, because I think a lot of people forget that we use a lot of oil to make into plastics and other compounds and all these things that we buy. So we have the ability now to make these different types of fuels that can give us this versatility in our energy system from plants.
Just adding to that, Rachel, so is the cost equation getting better now that if there's a secondary purpose or a secondary energy source to allow that reaction to happen, that means the costs coming down, it can be done more efficiently?
So what we're finding now is that it's not economic for a lot of things to be made in, a lot of plant material yet to be made into fuels, but if you have a high value product that is going to come from the grain or the seed, so say you're making a very expensive spirit or a vodka or something like that, that's going to sell for a lot of money, then you can use the waste and you can make a fuel out of that. Essentially you've covered your economy. And if you then if you're then using solar and wind, and which is getting cheaper, you can then use that to maybe help you with your hydrogen production, which Gus is going to talk about. So I think having an integrated approach where you're not dependent on one thing, and also being economically aware of what you can do with plants, gives you that flexibility and will bring the price down.
Thanks for that, Rachel. So energy is a cost, right? It's a big cost. What about energy as a source of economic growth for South Australia? Could any of you address this? Is energy an export for us?
Yeah, this is a very good point, because so currently, as I mentioned, Australia's economy, 70% of our economic exports last year came from exporting minerals and energy. So the energy products were primarily coal, but also LNG, and the minerals products include all things from iron ore, also gold, copper, etc. Now, of course, with coal, we know that there's the demand is decreasing. Although there is still significant demand, such as, for example, the politically divisive Adani mine, but nevertheless, on average, there's increasingly a trend from the global community away from coal. So on the one hand, this potentially constitutes a risk to our economy, but on the other hand, it also represents an opportunity. So, for example, Japan has set the target that they want by 2040 to be replacing their energy system. They currently predominantly a lot of their energy comes from our LNG. They import our liquefied natural gas, but they want to transform to be net carbon neutral or carbon free, and so they want that to be a hydrogen-based economy. So they've set this target, and although in Australian context, we know that the carbon debate has been very politically divisive. There's been one side to the other. We've had that kicked around, and the one that suffered has been our own political moving forward. But nevertheless, despite that being difficult, if there's someone who said, we'll buy something, everyone's going to jump in. And so The good thing is the Finkel review has identified that there's strong bipartisan support, at least at the moment, for introducing a hydrogen export market. And the kind of numbers we're talking would swamp the expected growth in hydrogen is so big that it could easily be a bigger market than our current exports of coal and natural gas together. Of course, there are many ways in which this could happen. People think about exporting liquid hydrogen. This is expensive, but one of the routes that's been considered. Maybe it might even be exported in the form of methane and then converted to hydrogen at the other end, or maybe ammonia. Ammonia is one of the ones that's been considered as a very prospective market. So there's a whole lot of technology opportunities by which it could happen, but this market could easily be bigger than our current exports of coal and natural gas. So this is really a big opportunity, and potentially we then could be exporting either carbon neutral or even renewable, and the pathway for these, it's possible maybe it might go via natural gas in stage one, or maybe definitely in South Australia now there's a couple of big hydrogen projects under construction or about to go ahead. One will go across in Port Lincoln, company H2U. There's a smaller hydrogen, renewable hydrogen process being built at Tonsley at the moment. And so these projects are already beginning to happen, and the costs of these are coming down. They're still more expensive, but there's a strong incentive for us as a country to invest if we can see a big market emerging.
Yeah, thanks, Gus. Rachel or David, any other export opportunities that you can think of, perhaps biofuel space or anything? Not for you, David.
Probably thinking more locally from a South Australian perspective. It's interesting that at the moment South Australia produces about 45% of its electrical energy each year from wind and solar, and that is continuing to grow. There are more developments of wind and solar power being built in our state, because as Gus is saying, we're very lucky with those resources. There's also consideration, and it's at a very advanced stage, of the local transmission company building an interconnector between South Australia and New South Wales. So this opens up opportunities for us to actually export our renewable sources to the eastern states, and also the interconnector will allow us to the additional interconnector will give us the geographic diversity to increasingly rely on renewable sources for our own electrical energy needs. But in terms of export opportunities, again, developing solar and wind resources locally within South Australia to support the production of hydrogen is very important. I guess the other important point here is that the electrification of the car fleet, it might be dismissed as a weekend spoiler by some, but I think that's a bit of a rearguard action. I think the electrification of the car fleet will occur in the next number of years. It'll be imposed upon us because people elsewhere from where we import vehicles are moving towards insisting on electrification of their own fleets. So that's going to happen. And when you think about it, an internal combustion engine with an efficiency of, I think, correct me Gus, about 20%. So in other words, of the fuel you put in your car, only 20% of that is actually moving the car forward, is a ridiculous waste of energy when you could think that if you can utilise renewable power to power your vehicle with an 80% efficiency round trip charging the vehicle efficiency, then it makes a lot more sense to move to electric vehicles.
I think as well as our energy, if we're going to export it, we should be able to export our expertise. South Australia punches above its weight in terms of the research and the knowledge about renewable energy, and I think we do pretty well. So I think that that's something that we could export to the world, I reckon.
Thanks, Rach. Look, fantastic panel session, but I think it's now time for our audience to get involved. Please raise your hand if you wish to ask a question of the panel. We've got some roving microphones hopefully ready to go around. Microphone's coming down, pick somebody at random and let's see how we go.
Just on the subject of a hydrogen economy, I'd just like someone to tell me if I'm right or wrong about this, but I imagine that if we had a large hydrogen industry in Australia, as well as providing an export product, it would enable us to easily fill in the gap between electrical supply and electrical demand from other sources. In other words, be ramped up and ramped down at will to manage that gap.
Yes, so the key question here is economics. So fundamentally, hydrogen can do anything that fossil fuels can do. We hold a high temp forum here annually where we look at the opportunities to decarbonise things like iron and steel, etc. Hydrogen could be used to decarbonise steel, and there's a lot of work going on there. We think that's probably one of the most prospective paths. Could be used for pretty much any process. Transport, power for back to generate electricity. The challenge is the cost. And the opportunity is how we find the way to bring the cost down. So already with current renewable hydrogen production technology, this is electrolysis from photovoltaic and wind, for example. It's recently, over the last couple of years, it's reached the point where there are now economic markets emerging. Nevertheless, if you take the anticipated cost, for example, the recent CSIRO study projected that by 2025 we'd be down to roughly $2 a kilogram of hydrogen. Now, when you convert that to dollars a gigajoule, comparing it with natural gas, it's still about double the cost of natural gas on an energy basis. So therefore, we still need new technology development to get to the point where we can displace natural gas as a fuel to run all of our industrial processes. So these developments are coming. It doesn't mean they're not there, but it means that investment and time is needed to keep bringing the cost down. As these costs come down, then the size of the wedge of how far into the market it will displace, that'll then continue to grow. So obviously, if you're going to make hydrogen from electricity, then currently you lose about 40% of the energy in going from electricity to hydrogen. So that means also you have to get more equipment to do that. So it costs to go from electricity to hydrogen. So if you're going to go via that route, then if you can do it electrically directly, you would want to do that. On the other hand, there are potentially completely different paths to make hydrogen. We don't have to go via electricity. It's just that this is currently the first one commercially off the blocks, and therefore it'll continue to grow and that will continue to have a market. But we can also go other routes. For example, one of the technologies we're working on is a methane cracking route. So the current route to go from methane, which of course methane, there is a fossil route, but there are also a lot of biomethane. In fact, that's growing. A recent study has suggested that probably 30% of Australia's natural gas network could be displaced by biomethane. So these are the digesters that you see around running off pig waste, etc. And so there's quite a bit of significant market there. But it's also possible to take hydrogen and go methane directly to carbon, solid carbon plus hydrogen. So this is not a commercial route, but it avoids making CO2. And so then the carbon could even be a valuable product, such as things like even carbon nanotubes, but also things like char.
cut you out here.
Many.
I saw so many questions up there in the audience. We do have to get to a few more.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gus.
Thank you very much for that dissertation. It's wonderful to see the good work our university is doing. Could you perhaps pull all that together and tell us what you would recommend to the state or federal government should spend their money on over the next 10 years to give us clean, cheap and reliable energy?
I've got a very long list in my bag. Do you want me? That's not very nice. You've given me the microphone and you're going to think about it. No, I'm going to give it back to Dave. There's too many things.
I think this costs nothing. I think what we need from the federal government and from our parliament, I should say, I think what we need are two things, an energy policy and a climate policy. And I think if we had both of those things, the rest would fall into place. At the moment, talking about the electricity sector, we have incredible orchestration across the system, and it's being managed by brilliant concert masters. The Parliament is the conductor, and until it pulls its finger out and does its job, we're going to continue to rely on the concert master, which are the operators of the grid, doing what they can and doing it very, very well, but we need that direction, we need that policy, and the parliamentarians need to do that. That costs nothing. It just requires direction.
In terms of where we should put our investment, I think we should be taking a technology neutral and a market-driven approach. This is well known to be the most economic way for decarbonising, but this unfortunately has become a political football. Nevertheless, what's happening increasingly around the world is that now the industry is decarbonising, not because of government direction, but because of risk. And so we have for example, there's increasingly companies are starting to, the cost of generating, for example, with coal, when you include a risk of capital that we expect that's growing into the future, adds to the cost probably more than what a carbon price would. In fact, that was a recent CSIRO study. So therefore, the more we can align our investments with the economic opportunities for Australia, the future economic opportunities will be around decarbonising the industries that we rely on. So we should be incentivising the technologies and the pathways that will be evaluating by decarbonising our agricultural products, our mineral products, all of our exports, because this is where the markets of the future are going to come from. In fact, there's already a 20% premium on, for example, low-carbon aluminium in some parts of the world, and so most of the big companies are starting to invest in decarbonising. So the more, I think our government should be fostering investments that will enable our industries to decarbonise and get ahead of the curve, because this is where the future economy is, but it's also good for our sustainable future.
Thanks, Gus. Last chance, Rachel. Anything on the wish list?
So I'm just sitting here, there's so many things running through my head, but this is an unashamed plug. So there are so many technologies that are already here that we don't need money for, that we just need to put into place. And I think we lose sight of that. We always think that we need more and better, but we actually have some amazing technologies for energy and for a better future. And if any of you have the chance to go and see the new film called 2040, which essentially tells us about these technologies which are already here and they can put in place, then please go and see it. It's an amazing movie, and it's one of these things that will give you hope for the future. But I think there are already so many things happening that we should tell our governments that we want more money pumped into.
Thanks. Probably got time for
Rachel, you did not mention biofuels from phytoplankton. but quite a few years ago I visited a dear friend, an organic chemist for whom I worked at Salisbury, by the name of Dr. John Baxter, and he showed me a file of biofuel that he made from phytoplankton with a closed process, and it seemed to be very promising, with the best source of the plankton being in the Darwin region. Could you comment on that, please?
So yes, phytoplankton is a very good source, but an even better source is actually giant kelp. So giant kelp grows metres every day, and you can anchor it to the sea floor. And again, a plug for 2040, because the kelp system is being developed, and it's an amazing resource. So I think probably, I've been talking about terrestrial biomass, cellulosic biomass. I think that what we will get in the ocean should be really carefully thought about. We don't want to wreck our oceans. We're already chucking heaps of plastic in there that needs to come out, but we can use it as a resource, and we can grow amazing amounts of biomass in the ocean, and giant kelp is a key example. Phytoplankton is probably as good, but it's not as easy to handle because it's millions of tiny things, whereas giant kelp is one big thing. So I think there is definitely a future in those kinds of plants that we can grow in the ocean as well as on land.
Thanks, Rachel. We've only got time for one more question. I think we have an audience member.
Okay, well, a big question then. A couple of years ago, the chief scientist suggested that South Australia and Tasmania could be generating 100% renewable energy in, say, 10, 12 years. I don't remember the exact date. If we're going to export our expertise on renewable energy to the world, surely we should actually demonstrate we can do it at home. So, how do we actually do it? What are the challenges? And at a lecture that Gus arranged a couple of years ago, it was suggested to do this, we'd actually need more interconnection and more storage. So how much of each do we actually need?
I guess, no, I guess the answer to the storage question is nobody knows. And I'm not even sure that we can go to 100% renewables in South Australia, but I think we can go a lot further than we currently are. And you ask about the challenges. Now, a number of the challenges are associated with decreasing system strength as we remove synchronous generation sources and replace them with asynchronous sources. But that is being managed technically now, and there are measures being put in place to install synchronous condensers, which are a synchronous machine, into the grid to provide the system strength that is going to be needed into the future to support higher levels of asynchronous generation. In terms of inertia, those synchronous condensers are also being proposed to be equipped with flywheels that will provide inertia into the system to give us the time that's needed when a system event occurs, such as the loss of another generator in the system, give the time that's necessary for governors to come into play in order to recover frequency. So there are technologies available in order to support the technological move from an essentially a synchronous grid to a largely asynchronous grid. As well, if in order to support that move to 100% renewables, or as far as we can get, then we will need to rely on storage. A lot of that storage will have to come from pump storage hydro. It will have to come in the form of virtual storage, in the form of being able to shift load to different times, so being in essentially demand side management, so that we become much more clever about the way in which we consume the load that we require. There are going to be opportunities for that with electric vehicles, staggering the charging of electric vehicles and so on to stagger the times at which vehicle charging occurs, for example. There's an awful lot of thermal storage in our homes and our buildings, which can be exploited as well to shift the times at which we cool the buildings and rely on thermal storage to maintain a comfortable environment for us and so on. So there are lots of opportunities there that we need to be able to exploit down the track. And the reason I mentioned that we don't know how much storage that we will need, it depends a lot on how much load shifting that we can accomplish and how clever we are about demand side management, because the cleverer we are on demand side management, the less storage we're going to need. There's another factor that comes into play as well. If we provide more renewable capacity than is actually needed, then that reduces the storage requirement as well. Storage is likely to remain more expensive for the time being than providing the primary renewable source such as solar PV or wind. So if we can provide more capacity in the system in renewable sources than we actually need, that too will lower the storage requirements. So I'm not trying to evade your question, I'm just saying that there's a lot of work to be done to actually work that out. But the technology and the smarts are there amongst the people I mentioned earlier, the thousands of people that drive the system currently to be able to deliver that.
So how long will it take?
Maybe I'll just add a complimentary comment. I think when David was talking about renewables there, he was talking about intermittent renewables. I mean, hydrogen would be, or alternative fuels would be a critical part to allow that to be met. So currently you could provide the standby generators of gas turbines. So most of the systems that are envisaging 100% renewables will consider ongoing use of gas turbines as part of that mix, and they could come from renewable fuels, could be biomethane, could be hydrogen, and so that's the other component that's needed to meet that. So the question is how quickly it takes to get the cost of those down. I would say, most people are talking targets around 2040 to 2050. Those kind of timelines seem to be reasonable.
Thanks, Gus, and thanks to our panellists. Look, the interest in this particular Research Tuesday topic was overwhelming. We had to cut off registrations and we had a long waiting list. The numbers of your questions that went unanswered, I do apologise. It just does indicate how much enthusiasm and interest there is in this topic. I do want to thank our speakers from your left to right, Rachel Burton, David Voles, Gus Nathan. Thanks very much for your time, and hopefully you all found it quite elucidating. That concludes this evening's event. We're going to be back next month on the 9th of July with a topic, Quantum of Promise, a look at quantum physics and its role in our everyday lives. Please make sure you register early to attend. If it's anything like tonight, it'll be booked out. Thank you all again for coming, and good night.